Okay, this next segment will be building the frames, and when you open the frame bag, this is what you get. You get the side frames, these spacers which hold the battery plates on, these larger spacers which hold the bottom plate onto the frames, and we'll show that during the build, your anti-rotation gyro mount, bottom plate, this is the battery tray, and this is a secondary battery tray. And then your blocks, you have your tail rotor drive blocks, your boom blocks, your main shaft blocks, and your motor mount blocks. Also in the kit comes these flat-headed screws, and you'll see if you look at them close. Some screws have a flat head on them like this, and some of the screws that come in this bag here have a larger head on them, or look like a thumb screw. And during the build, we'll show where those go. These screws go in certain places, like on the bottom of the bottom tray and on the battery tray, so your battery doesn't rub on the heads. And then these usually go on the outside of the frame. So during the build, we'll show where all these screws go and where other parts in the baggie goes. Okay, so with that introduction, let's get started. Okay, in this next segment, we're going to put the large spacers. These are the three that are rectangle in shape, and we're going to mount these to the bottom of the frame piece. Now, the bottom of the frame, if you look close, one side of the frame has a taper to the hole, and the other side does not. This is the bottom. The screws will go through on this side, and the blocks will mount on this side. Now, it's important to note that these blocks do have an orientation. As you'll see, the screw holes offset in the block. The block mounts to the frame like this, so that the offset hole is sitting high in relation to the frame, and the tapered holes are on the bottom of the frame. Okay. Now for this step, we will use these flatter head screws that came in the kit. They have a flat head, a very small flat head on them, and they're used to hold these blocks to the bottom of the frame. The screws with the larger head are not used on this step, just the flat head ones. Now don't forget to use blue Loctite. Anywhere you have a machine screw going into aluminum, you want to use Loctite. So we will apply some Loctite to each of these screws and attach these blocks to the frame in this orientation. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and mount these blocks, and we'll come back with that step completed. Okay, we've finished mounting our blue blocks to the bottom of the frame. And as you see, once again, there's three places they go. Here, here, and here. Okay? So these get mounted, again, with this hole offset high on the frame. So this is the bottom of the frame, and this goes up into the helicopter. Okay? So bottom line, this is the way it's going to be with these three holes. Now, our next step we're going to do is we have our two battery trays, and we have our small 3 blocks. Now these 3 blocks, if you'll notice, that the holes are basically center in the shaft, so it doesn't matter which way they go. And you'll also notice that on these trays, there is no taper in the holes, so they can go either side. This can be flipped either way. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to attach 2 blocks here and 1 block here of these 3, and once again, we are going to use our flat head screws to mount these on here. And again, don't forget your blue Loctite. So we're going to go ahead and mount the blocks, and I'll come back and show that completed. Okay, so we have our bottom frame complete, and we have our 2 battery trays with 1 aluminum block on this one and 2 aluminum blocks on this one. Again, it doesn't matter which way they're flipped, and we'll see when we put these in the frame. So our next step now is to take one of the frame halves. It doesn't matter which side you use, because basically they're the same. And our next step is we're going to go ahead and we're going to mount the main shaft blocks to one side of the frame. Okay? So we're going to put the main shaft blocks on one side of the frame. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to build 1/2 of the frame, and then once we get all our parts on there, we will go ahead and put on the other half. So that is the build plan for this frame. Now, I need you to notice something on these blocks. Each one of these blocks are identical, okay? They're both the same. However, you'll notice that the bearing is exposed on one side and it is not on the other. It is important these blocks go on this frame in the proper orientation. Okay, so the way that works is the open side of this block, where the open bearing is, the open side is going to go in one spot of the frame, and then the open side of the bearing will go on the top, pointed toward the top half of the frame. So again, this is the open spot here, the open area of the bearing, and this is the open area of the bearing. Do not reverse these. So again, open facing toward the bottom of the heli, and open bearing facing toward the top of the heli. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to mount these two blocks onto this main frame, and I'll come back and show the completed segment. Okay, so we've mounted our bearing blocks. Now, one thing to note, for holding things on the frame, we use the larger head screws. These are the screws. They look like thumb screws. Okay, they have a knurl to them, and they're larger head. So we did those. Now, this is what's important. Again, these blocks go in a certain orientation. With the tail block pointed toward you, these blocks should mount so this servo angle here is sticking out the left side of the frame. So this is the right side of the frame with the tail pointing toward you, and then the left side of the frame, it went later when we mount it, will have this servo block sticking out on this side of the frame, okay? And that's the way it'll go. Now, what's important here is you'll notice the open bearing on the top, and if we flip the frame, the open bearing is on the bottom here, okay? Open bearing with these tangs sticking out on the left side of the frame and nothing sticking out on the right side of the frame. And again, the larger Allen screws, okay? So our next step, what we're going to do is we're going to mount the bottom plate, okay? And we're going to go ahead and mount our battery trays to the frame, all right? So I'm going to go ahead and mount those, and we'll show the completion of that. Okay, so we basically have now our bottom tray mounted to one side of the frame. As you can see, the aluminum blocks go up. We have the two battery trays mounted, and the aluminum blocks face down to the heli. Don't flip those or have those backwards, okay? So basically that's, we've got those pieces mounted. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to mount the motor mount. Now the motor mount does have a direction in which it goes, and if you look, you'll see that there's an offset here. So one side is completely flat, and the other side has an offset in it, which way it mounts. So the flat side of this motor mount faces toward the top of the helicopter, okay? So we're going to go ahead and mount these. Again, we're going to use our knurled screws, and again, don't forget the Loctite. Loctite everywhere anytime you're attaching to the metal, okay? So we're going to go ahead and mount the motor mount now with the flat side facing toward the top of the helicopter. Okay, so now we have our motor mount mounted. Again, the flat side is toward the top of the helicopter. And again, everywhere we mounted our plates and things, we used the larger knurled screws, okay? Just overviewing that. Okay, our next step is to mount the boom blocks. Now, the boom blocks do have a certain side to them. If you will notice, one side of a boom block, there are no threads. It goes straight through. As you can see, the screw goes straight through. There's no thread. While the other side of the boom block has threads in it, okay? So it's important to get that orientation. Additionally, the boom blocks go with this flange. There's a flange here on the block, and that flange faces toward the inside. Okay, so we have two sets of boom blocks. Two of them that have threads, and that is threads where the screw does not go through, it's threaded, and two that do not, okay? So what we're going to do next in this next step is we're going to mount these with the flanges of the boom block facing inward, and we're going to mount these to the frame like so, using, again, the knurled screws, Allen screws, and we're going to screw them to this side of the frame, and the sides with the no threads in them, those will go on later when we assemble the rest of the heli, okay? So flanges in, all right, threaded sides. We're going to go ahead and screw these to the frame. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we'll come back and review that. Okay, so we've mounted our boom blocks, and as you can see, the flanges are on the inside, and we used the knurled screws to hold those on. Not these bigger ones, the knurled screws. The bigger ones later, this is why these boom blocks are hollow on this side, is later we will, when we do the other side of the frame, we will attach these, and these longer screws screw into threads here, okay? So just overview to make sure you get the right blocks on this side of the heli. So once again, we've basically got almost all our pieces on one side of the helicopter. All right, so the next step is in order to put the final blocks on the helicopter, the tail drive blocks, you need to open up your gear bag and pull this out of the bag. Now, in order to assemble these, you'll notice these blocks are open on one side and not on the other, and these go a certain way. So in order to assemble this, what we need to do is we need to remove the pulley from this tail belt drive. So basically just go ahead, and you got to get the right Allen wrench. I'm going to go ahead and remove the 2 Allen screws and remove this pulley, and we'll come back and talk about how to assemble these bearings into these blocks. Okay, the next step is we removed our pulley from the shaft because we need to do that to get these blocks on. Now, if you look at these 2 blocks, you will notice one block does not have a grub screw hole on it, and one block has a grub screw hole on it. That block goes on the top where this knurled shaft is, okay? The reason that is that screw will hold that bearing in. All right? So the first step, what we want to do is let's attach the lower block. I use just a little bit of Loctite on the bearing. Okay, smear it around. Don't make a mess. Don't get it in the bearing, just on the outside. And we go ahead and we take our block without the grub screw, and we go ahead and attach that, and we press it on. Now press easy and firmly, okay, smoothly. The idea being is that the bearing should be flush with the aluminum block, okay? So now we have that. The next step is I'm going to go ahead and still apply just a thin coat of Loctite on this bearing. Now we take the block that has our grub screw hole in it, and we go ahead and we push that block on here as well. And again, push it down even force so that the bearing is flush with the aluminum block, okay? Now what we can do is we can go ahead and we take our Allen wrench, put a little bit of Loctite on this grub screw, and the grub screw is in the bag. It's the smaller of the grub screws that came in the bag, and we go ahead and we tighten up this grub screw. Now it's important that you don't over tighten this. If you over tighten this, you could damage the bearing. So just a firm tightness enough to hold that bearing from coming out of the block, and you can test by pulling on the block, and as you can see, that grub screw is now holding it. If you over tighten this grub screw, you will damage this outer race of the bearing, okay? So now the final step is, with our grub screw in, is we can put our pulley back on. Now on both of these screws, what you want to do is you want to remove them completely and go ahead and put a little bit of Loctite, pardon me here, put a little bit of Loctite on the screw. Don't make a mess of it, just a little bit, okay? And go ahead and put them in the pulley, start them. Do the same thing on the second one, take it out, okay? Put some Loctite on it, start it, and then now we can put our pulley on. Now when we put our pulley on, what we don't want to do is we don't want to have the pulley rubbing on the top of this block, okay? So when we put the pulley on, we want to make sure there's a slight gap in the pulley. So just make a little bit of a gap and go ahead and tighten up one of the screws, like so. Okay, and again, make sure there's a little bit of a gap between this block so that it does not rub, the pulley does not rub on the top of this block, okay? So it's important you leave a little bit of a gap. Go ahead and tighten up the other screw, and we're all set, and the next step is we'll go ahead and put this in the frame. Okay, we've basically mounted our belt drive pulley blocks in the frame. You'll notice on the blocks there's a little tab, and that tab lines up with the holes in the frame here, and then just go ahead and use the knurled thumb screws to hold these 2 blocks on. Now, the next step we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, now we've got all our other pieces on the frame, is we're going to go ahead and put our other side on the frame, okay? But before we do that, we need to make sure we get the gyro plate in. All right, and that basically lines up in a notch back here. There's a notch right here at the top of the boom block. That basically lines up there. And our anti-rotation bracket, which there's a notch right here on the top of the frame, and that goes right here. Okay, now you may have to hold that in place, but the idea being is once you get all these in here, we're going to take the other half of the frame and we're going to go ahead and place it onto the blocks, okay? We don't have to worry about our rear boom blocks yet. We'll do those after we get the frame screwed together. Okay, so line up the anti-rotation, line up the gyro plate, line up the two tabs for the drive, tail drive. Okay, and basically we go ahead and we line that up. And so we've got our gyro plate in, we've got our anti-rotation in the notch, all the holes are lined up and the frame set down. And then we just go ahead and we take the rest of these grub screws and we put them on this half of the frame. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and show you the completed frame. Okay, so there we have it. We have both sides of the frame now put together. The only piece missing now is the other two boom blocks. Now if you remember, these were the boom blocks that have no threads in them, as you see. Okay, so now we can go ahead and we can put these in the helicopter. So basically you just line them up. Okay, and go ahead and put the long bolts through. Okay, like so. So basically we got these blocks in with the long screws. And once again, we're just going to finger tighten these because since we haven't got the boom on yet, we don't tighten these longer bolts up yet. Okay, so same thing with the back one. Remember, flange goes on the inside, so we go ahead and hold that in place, and just once again finger tight for now. Just finger tight. All right, just to hold the blocks in place. Okay, so there you have it. That is the completed frame for the HDX 450. All the blocks are in, etc., etc. Now, one thing I want to go over a little bit of, when you assemble the other half of the frame, these tabs have to line up with the frame on both sides. Now, what might happen is, if you remember, I had you tighten this grub screw in here. Okay, you may find that the bearing may have to come down a little bit. So go ahead and loosen this grub screw. If these tangs don't line up when you put the other half on, loosen this grub screw holding this bearing and allow this bearing to come down. Do not allow this lower bearing to come up. It should remain flush, but this one here is adjustable due to the grub screw. So loosen the grub screw, get the tangs to line up on both sides, and then once the bearing's seated so the pulley's nice and smooth, you can go ahead and retighten this grub screw. And remember, don't over tighten it. If you over tighten it, you may damage the bearing. But bottom line, that's adjustment there in case these don't line up. All right, so bottom line, that is the frame set all together. In our next segment, we'll go ahead and we'll talk about mounting the main shaft. I'm sorry, I must make one correction to this video. In the beginnings, I had you put these grub screws on the back here near the anti-rotation bracket. You can go ahead, this was just for assembly purposes so you didn't break it off the frame. You can go ahead and remove these now at the top near the anti-rotation, and what goes there are the canopy standoffs. So don't forget to put a little bit of Loctite on the canopy standoff because it is going into aluminum. And go ahead and you can put, at this time, go ahead and put the canopy standoffs on the frame, okay? So put it on this side, put the other one on this side, and now you're good to go with the frame. So just a correction to the video when I was showing you this. But it's a good idea to use these screws to hold it together while you're assembling. And then when you're all done, go ahead and put these back on, all right?